Hello, this is Dr. John Wineland again with another in our restoration history discussions. This time it's contact between different groups, New England and the southern movements of the restoration movement, along with the western groups as well. So I want to take a quick look at how these groups interacted with one another. So the contact then between these groups, let's take a look. One of the things that we have mentioned in the past is the importance of the religious periodicals, journals that were published by these various leaders. And here you see an image of the cover of the Herald of Gospel Liberty, which was an important one from New England. And so this is a way that we can sometimes detect contact and also the way that they at that time found out about each other was through these kinds of journals. Well, in 1804, the southern and the western groups we know had some contact. The southern groups had contact through Rice Haggard, because Rice Haggard was there in the South when they were going to call themselves Republican Methodists. He said, why you want to call yourself Republican Methodist? Why don't you just call yourself Christians? And then later on, Rice Haggard is there with Stone and others in Kentucky. And when they were calling themselves the Springfield Presbytery, he says, why are you still calling yourself Presbyterians? You've left the Presbyterian. They basically kicked you out. Why don't you just call yourself Christian? So he was really advocating for this, and we've talked about that elsewhere. But that is definitely one contact between them. Now, we know there's contact in 1808 between the New England group and the West. How do we know that? Well, in the very first issue of Elias Smith's journal, the Herald of Gospel Liberty, that you see cover of here, he prints completely the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. That's how, not only did he know about it, but he thought that was important enough to print it up in his journal so everybody could read it. So obviously he had heard about what was going on there and had a copy of it. Now, in 1810, a couple years later, Elias Smith is going to move south to Philadelphia. And this will put him in closer proximity to the Southern Christian movement, and he'll begin to encounter them there. And he has contacts with them at that point. So we're going to see that he will actually visit the Virginia Christian Conference, their annual meeting, in 1811. So he is going to learn all about them. He begins to find out how they have a lot of things in common. I like this little picture of Elias Smith, and the caption says, just minister of the New Testament. I think that's interesting. Just that. It doesn't have any other labels on there. Well, we'll see then that Smith visiting the Virginia Conference, and then there will begin to be contact there between sort of what you might call the Smith movement or the New England movement and that in the South. So in 1820s there were conferences, we know, where different individuals from all three geographic areas were meeting together, all three groups, in the 1820s. So they knew about each other. They were talking with one another and so forth. And there was the idea that there should be some principles of union. That is, what can we unify? There's North's book is called Union in Truth, right? North's book, Jim North's book, Union in Truth. So it's not just union for the sake of union or unity and overlooking differences. We have to have some kind of agreement to be able to come together. Well, that's what this is. Part of it is that you'll have Christ as the only head of the church, that you wouldn't have some other sort of superstructure over it. Just Christ. He should be the head. Christian character would be the measure of church membership. that basically you'd have to, as we might say at one time, walk the walk as well as talk the talk. You're going to have to live a life of Christian character as well. So that would be another idea. The Christian name. Let's just use the name Christian. Let's not use denominational names. Taking the Bible as the all-sufficient rule of faith and practice. Now, some of this ought to sound familiar to you if you've been watching the other presentations, because these are very similar ideas that we see. And that there could be individual interpretation of the Scriptures. That we're not going to sort of rigidly say, here are these things, and this is the way it has to be. In other words, they're not going to have a creed that will basically tell you what you have to believe. You're going to have to study the Scriptures and come to understand them. And then, of course, a striving for unity among all disciples. Okay? So, unity, individual interpretation, using the Bible, the Christian name, Christian character, and Christ as the only head of the group. Now, eventually we're going to see that this Christian church, as it will, sort of the New England branch of it, will sometimes be called at this period the Christian Church USA, or in other times it's called the Christian Connection. The Christian Connection. A formal organization develops later in the 19th century for the Christian Connection. And this actually has a headquarters in Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. And in 1830, reportedly they had about 50,000 members of the Christian Connection. About 15,000 of those are in what they would call at that time the West. The West being Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, even Alabama and Missouri. So not just in, say, New England, but elsewhere. And in fact, some of the Christian Connection churches, congregations, will join in with Stone and Campbell in 1832. They'll join in with the disciples there, especially in western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, and eastern Ohio, because they had a lot of overlap there. So the Christian Connection then, as many groups will have, of course, is troubles when it comes to the time of the Civil War. There's going to be a division over the Civil War and how to handle this, especially slavery and the Civil War. We see this happening with many groups. For example, I'm sure you've heard of the Southern Baptist. The Southern Baptists divided from the Northern Baptists at this time. The Northern Baptists today are called the American Baptists, but the Southern Baptists still called the Southern Baptists. Same with the Methodists. Methodists had division and so forth. We won't go through them all, but this was a pivotal dividing issue, was the Civil War. So we see by 1915, the number had increased to 114,000 members at that time in the Christian Connection. By the late 19th century, there were discussions with the Christian Connection to merge with the Congregational churches. And so this will eventually lead to a merger in 1931 with the Congregational churches and the Christian Church, or in this case, when I call it the Christian Connection, merge in 1931, and then they form a new group. And in 1959, they merge with the Evangelical and Reformed Church. And so this eventually ends up being, by that time in 1959, called the United Church of Christ. So the United Church of Christ, or UCC. This group is still around today. And in fact, there are discussions now, talks of unity between the disciples of Christ and the United Church of Christ. They've had these discussions for quite a while about uniting their congregations. One of the points of contention or dispute is over the ordination of homosexual ministers and how to deal with that entire topic, which the United Church of Christ accepts. The disciples, at this point, most of them do not. So I don't know where that merger will go, but they've been talking about it now for several years. Well, this is just some of the interaction then between the various groups. Just a brief overview to give you an idea of how these three groups work together and sometimes even merged together along this path that we might call the Restoration Movement. Well, I hope you have a great day.